Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for that amazing intro. Thanks to Maxon for bringing me out to talk to everyone today. And hello to everyone joining in on the live stream. Good of you to be here. So my name is Thom Haig. I'm a freelance 3D artist and director based in London. I introduced Cinema 4D into my workflow many years ago, way back when the current version was released 10.5. The MoGraph module back then was a brand new thing, stuff of a madman's dreams, very enabling tool. And that's what largely helped me get into Cinema 4D, doing motion graphic stuff for film and broadcast. Of course, I use Cinema 4D for client work, for commercial projects, but a big passion of mine regarding using these tools is using Cinema 4D to make original short films. And within all the kind of specific things within Cinema 4D, all the specialities that people go into, I like to think that I kind of dip my toe into everything a little bit, but I also find myself focusing on the realm of, I guess, the pursuit of photoreal rendering, generating as realistic an imagery as I can. If we can convince people that what we're seeing is not a render, then for me that's really has a great sense of achievement to it. So I also, of course, with this, enjoy playing around with all kinds of different render engines. Of course, there are many of these. And so today I'm going to be talking to you guys about a very recently launched short film, uploaded just on Wednesday this week. It's called Otherside. It was made primarily in Cinema 4D, of course. And we're going to play the entirety of the film in a moment. But before we watch it, I'd just like to talk to you guys a little bit about what Otherside is and the idea behind the theme, the narrative about it. Now, it's something that is pretty terrifying. It's, you might want to avert your eyes at this stage, because a big influence to Otherside as a short film is 2016. 2016, a very significant and unpredictable 365 days that we had. Of course, we had some pretty landmark geopolitical events that took place in 2016. Of course, primarily I'm talking about, for a Brit like me, it's very significant, the UK voting to leave the European Union, and finally getting used to the idea of referring to Donald Trump as President Donald Trump. But regardless of these things, and I'll make it clear that I wouldn't have put my name to either of them, what I found quite concerning about the events in 2016, and I guess I kind of foresaw them happening, and they did both turn out to be very marginal votes, very marginal elections, how the votes were divided, was this idea that we live in the case of the UK, a divided Britain. We had this media narrative of divided Britain. I guess I foresaw something of a kind of a divide, but I feel that was kind of strengthened, and the media kind of went away with this idea of divided Britain, and it was quite kind of, it lacked a three-dimensionality, if you will, this kind of stereotyping of people. You're either a Leave voter or a Remain voter, or you're a Trump voter or a Clinton voter, and the media would portray you as one or the other, and all the stereotypes that came with these things. So with Otherside, I wanted to present something of a counter-narrative to that. As a man much better than me put so eloquently, we cannot be consumed by petty differences anymore. We will be united by our common interests. That man, of course, was the best president the US never had, played by the actor Bill Pullman in Independence Day, one of the best speeches ever put to film. So with that said, give you a bit of background about where I was coming from with Otherside. I think it's time that we watch the film. It's just 3 minutes long. I hope you guys enjoy it.
In examining, measuring our progress as a society, what do we discover about ourselves? We have endeavored, we have advanced, we stand now at the peak of humanity's achievement. And yet, in this moment of unprecedented prosperity and technological advancement, we find ourselves in a paradox, vulnerable to anxiety and depression, insecure, untrusting of difference, without community. We are driven to consume, working to spend, hearing only the muffled voices of others from the other side, who, like us, must know that this cannot go on. And we go on, oblivious to the structures that confine us, believing that we must, that we can ascend to great heights, to ever-rising, unreachable heights. Unjust, the surface beneath us shifts. And no matter how motivated, how desperate, so many remain hopelessly grounded. A collective aspiration beyond circumstance. Aspiration that becomes resentment. Watching as others continue upwards, rising beyond perception to greater altitudes. We are divided. Isolated, we witness only the world as it is presented to us. Distrust and misdirected anger. From within the safety of closed doors, closed minds, we are shown the danger of the other side. Unable to hear one another over deafening noise. Told that strength lies in fear, in hate. That trust is weakness. But what if, against the adversity of an angry, divided world, we choose to believe in each other, looking past differences that seemed insurmountable, listening, hearing at last. What if we realize that, together, we all have more? Because we are not alone. Because there is no other side.
Thanks very much, guys. And a big thank you to all the other people whose names you're seeing on screen right now. I had the opportunity to work with some incredibly talented artists who collaborated on Otherside with me. It's great when I reached out to different artists that they were willing to be involved. So that's Otherside. Thanks once again for everyone being involved, and hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy the ideas that are kind of discussed in Otherside. And with Otherside, I refer to it as a short film. I appreciate it's not a conventional short film. There's no dialogue. There are no actors. But I think this is quite a sort of working with tools like Cinema 4D and coming from a motion graphics background gives us quite a unique opportunity, because in the world of motion graphics, I'm sure we've all seen, and many of us have made these kind of explainer videos explaining what businesses do and the rest of it. But I think motion graphics as a medium and these tools lend themselves so well to communication. So I like this idea of using a concise script and a voiceover and abstract and relative visuals to make something that's really unique. So with that said, here's what we're going to be taking a look at today. 3 things, hopefully we'll get around to all of them. Initially, we're going to be taking a look at using Redshift Renderer, which is the render engine that Otherside was made with. Secondly, we're going to be taking a look at something else, something a bit different. We're going to be taking a look at the relationship between how some knowledge of working with real-world production cameras, working in a sort of a real physical environment, can inform how we work in a virtual environment, working with tools like Cinema 4D. And finally, we're going to be taking a look at a little kind of unique lighting process that was used in Otherside that I'm looking forward to sharing with you guys. So Redshift, let's talk a little bit about Redshift. Redshift has been around for a little while for other 3D applications, and it's recently been released for Cinema 4D. So yet another render engine for us Cinema 4D types to get to play around with. But it's a great tool. Here's an example of a few shots from Otherside. Just to give you an example of what Redshift is doing, we have the kind of wireframe. Then the first pass that you see is just the raw render without any post-production. Then the final kind of wipe is the finished shot with post-production, which in this case was done with After Effects. Now, what is Redshift? Redshift is a GPU-based biased renderer. It's quite a mouthful, but what does that mean? It means that it's GPU-based, similar to renderers like Octane, in that it uses the graphics card, or the GPU, instead of the processor, or the CPU. And similar to many other render engines, such as V-Ray, it's a biased renderer. And what this means is that it optimizes the amount of calculations it has to do to produce a final image. It kind of finds shortcuts, and with that comes less render time. So with this combination of using the GPU and being biased, has the potential to be enormously fast. And I consider Redshift to be a very robust, production-ready render engine. Testament to this, Otherside was rendered almost, or it was all shots, sort of about 95% of shots in Otherside were rendered with Redshift, and all of those were rendered with Redshift in an alpha version, so even a pre-production alpha version of the software, and I was very impressed with how it held up. Absolutely minimal crashes, so that made working with it much, much easier, like I say, especially considering it being an alpha version. And I was interested in Redshift kind of purely by what it offered, that being it being a biased GPU-based render engine, but on top of that, it came from an idea that I would explore to end up being something of a necessity, especially for many of the shots in Otherside being kind of a low-lit interior scene. The first and last scene in the film is this kind of dim interior with these flickering kind of old-school CRT screens. And I did try rendering with other unbiased render engines, and the nature of it being an interior, there being kind of restricted lighting and space for that lighting to bounce around meant that render times were not optimal. So Redshift became completely invaluable in getting those renders out in a reasonable space of time. And I underline all of this by saying, whilst it might sound like I'm from the Redshift marketing team, I'm just a guy who uses it and likes it. And I also say this because, there is no single best render engine. I'm sure many of you appreciate this. Because there's so many render engines available to us Cinema 4D artists right now, we've seen this kind of exchange where many artists and studios almost define themselves with their render engine of choice. I like to think if there was one single best render engine, we'd all have the sense to be using it. I think there's some virtue in being quite render engine agnostic. But with that being said, Redshift is definitely one of the good ones out there, possibly one of the best ones out there, and it's well worth exploring if anything that I've just said piques your interest. And so we're going to be taking a look at how to make a few materials, a few kind of shaders with Redshift, starting off with a kind of a simple plastic kind of shader like this. And I'll also say, sort of hands up, if it looks like I'm not making these materials live in front of you guys right now, it's because I'm not. One of the limitations, or a hardware requirement, I should say, of Redshift is that it runs with NVIDIA GPUs. Laptop that we have here has got AMDs, so like any good cooking show, here's one I made earlier. We have some pre-recorded stuff from the workstation back home. And also, I want to say a thank you to a very phenomenally talented 3D artist called Raphael Rao. If you recognize the material test scene that I'm using here, he's kindly made it available to all of us through a great page on his site called Free Stuff. The material test scene that you can download there is for Octane. I've merely downloaded that and adjusted it ever so slightly to Redshift. But thanks very much, Raphael. His website, if you don't know it already, is silverwing-vfx.de. So let's talk ourselves through how we make materials with Redshift. So like any other third-party renderer in Cinema 4D, Redshift integrates into Cinema via a series of Redshift-specific tags. We have a few specific materials. So we have different material types that are specific to Redshift, as well as a few specific Redshift objects, lights, environments, etc. We'll be taking a look at a few more of those later. And within all the Redshift material types, there's a Redshift material, if you will, and that's kind of the Uber material, the one that caters for almost all purposes. And within this, as you can see, as I'm doing here, within the base properties tab of a material, we can very easily dial in the parameters that we need. So I've changed the diffuse to a red, make it a red kind of plastic. I've changed the IOR, or the index of refraction, to 1.45. And I've just kind of adjusted the reflection weight and the reflection roughness. And this by itself is something of a kind of decent procedural, brand new, clean out of the factory box kind of plastic, but we can add further detail to that through textures, of course. So in the instance that you see here, I've used the reflection roughness channel. I've added a reflection roughness input to my material and loaded in a texture, a kind of just a black and white dirt map. And that does tons and tons by default, but we can lessen the amount of that, the effect that that has by using a ramp, Redshift ramp. And that's very similar to if you used to the other render engines using a colorizer or using a gradient. And what this does is give us much more control over what this black and white texture is doing. So we can be very specific over the contrast, the amount of contrast that this has. It means we can also control the amount of differentiation. So with a ramp, as you can see, initially, I might delete one knot, find a gray value. That seems to be a good amount of reflection roughness. And once that's fine-tuned, add a second knot, define that amount of differentiation, so we can see a bit of that texture giving us some irregular roughness that contributes to a greater sense of realism. Of course, another thing what we can do is use bump to give us some kind of surface detail, some little knocks and scratches. I've taken another very versatile black and white kind of scratch map. That once again goes into a Redshift ramp, which then goes into a Redshift bump node, which can then be piped in. And immediately we'll see that's doing tons and tons. It looks like it's really been hacked into. But we can just back off the amount of bump through bringing back that height scale, something a bit more modest. I think with all these things, it can often pay off to be very subtle with how we utilize our textures in our materials. You know, sometimes it can be a case of less is more. Sometimes some very fine scratches can go a very long way to help us achieve a greater sense of realism. Okay, so that's a kind of a basic, ever so slightly worn plastic. Next, let's take a look at how we can go about making a kind of older, antique-style wooden floor. Okay. So just to save you having to watch me add all the necessary inputs, I typically have a kind of a preset that I'll add into my content browser, which will have all the standard channels that I'd use for a basic kind of solid surface material in Redshift, those being the diffuse color, the reflection roughness, and the bump input. I often in that preset would consider to have a few kind of in-between nodes, those being a color correction node in the case of the diffuse channel, and with the reflection ones, a Redshift ramp, and a Redshift ramp also for roughness. So with all those in place, I've loaded in the textures that you can see that are from a website you might well know it already. It's called Polygon, P-O-L-I-I-G-O-N. Really good resource for getting lots of very high-res textures for 3D artists. I've got a normal map that's loaded into the bump channel as well. Now, Redshift doesn't require a specific normal map input, as some render engines do. You can just pipe it into the bump map, and it kind of knows by default that we're looking at height data. And as was the case for the other previous material, the red material that we made just now, we can use our Redshift ramps to be very specific about the amount of reflection. If we load in these textures and we see that the reflection isn't how we think it should look, we can have more reflection, less reflection, more roughness, more glossiness via changing these black and white values on our Redshift ramps. This texture set also includes a displacement map, which is really valuable for a kind of material like this. So it's very simple to implement that. We can load in a displacement map. That goes into a Redshift displacement node, which then gets piped into the final output all the way on the right of the chain. And in order to see that displacement, all we need to do is to add a Redshift tag onto the geometry, enable tessellation, and enable displacement. As you can see there, it's done tons immediately. It all kind of poofs out like a big balloon. But we can dial that back through the height scale, get something a bit more sensible. Another thing that's quite important to look at is these 4 sliders all the way towards the bottom right of the screen, because through those we can designate our midpoint of the displacement. Now, by default, the minimum displacement is 0. the maximum is 1. And what this means is that it will only push out geometry. By setting the minimum displacement to -1, then we kind of get a push and pull, and it will see a mid-gray as our midpoint of the displacement, which is appropriate for the texture that we've been using there. So I appreciate it's not the easiest thing to see that displacement in action on that sort of spherical material test scene. So here we can see a bit more of a realistic context. The rendering on the left is just with a normal map for its height data, and the one on the right uses the displacement channel also. And it's particularly appropriate for the kind of surface like this, an old antique type wood. It's not a modern varnished laminate flooring, so we have those little knocks and dents and surface detail that displacement is really valuable for. And at final material, we can look to make something a little bit different, but we can make a kind of scratched metal surface. Is this playing? Not quite yet, but it is now. Great. So with this, we can look at something a little different. We can look at making two materials and mixing between them. I've sped up this process to save you seeing me do exactly the same process that I've done twice already now. I don't quite work this fast. I wish I did, but yeah, it's probably at double speed or thereabouts. But what I'm making initially is our kind of matte black base layer. And this is kind of just the painted metal surface before it's undergone any damage, any knocks and scratches. And as has been the case with, say, the initial plastic that we made, I'm just using the bump map and the reflection roughness inputs to get a greater sense of surface detail. And these kind of imperfections are all the more relevant for a material like this, where it is scratched, it has surface wear, so we can expect things not to look brand new, straight out of the factory, straight out of the product box. So with those things loaded up, we have something of a kind of an adequate matte black surface. And what we can do from there is load a second Redshift material into our shader graph, our node tree. This one will be the much more kind of chrome metallic shader. We won't see what that's doing until we pipe it into our end node at the end there. We can see that's a very shiny chrome, and that's simply been achieved by lowering the diffuse amount to a very sort of dark gray or black, and increasing the IOR, the index of refraction. In this case, I think it's put it to 5. And again, in the interests of achieving a greater sense of realism, I've just loaded a sort of simple black and white dirt map texture into the reflection roughness parameter of that. So there we have on top, the higher node is our matte black, the lower one is our chrome kind of node. And we can blend between those using a Redshift material blender is the name of the node. So we pipe those in. The matte black goes into the base color, the chrome into layer 1. That then goes into the final output. Now by default, we can only just see the matte black, but we can begin to be a bit more specific as to how these two materials blend with one another through this chain of nodes that we'll see now. Now I have to thank another very talented motion designer by the name of Rich Nosworthy, who introduced me into this quite involved series of nodes, but it does get that nice edge scratched kind of look that I'm a real big fan of. So the nodes that we see here, now listen carefully because it's a little bit complex, but it's one that I've committed to long-term memory now. First we have our texture, which is our kind of dirt map. That then goes into a Redshift multiply node. That then goes into the radius parameter of a Redshift curvature node. And it's the Redshift curvature node that will detect the kind of harder edges of any geometry. And finally, that goes into a Redshift ramp. And so we really control the radius through that second node, which is a Redshift multiply, and then add some contrast finally with the node at the end, which is a Redshift ramp. These then are being piped into the blend parameter between those black and white, and we have a kind of scratched, matte, black, painted metal look to it. One last thing that I'm a really big fan of in Redshift is atmosphere and volumetrics, and it can take longer in some render engines, quicker in others, but Redshift is so easy and so quick to set this kind of thing up. So I've got a dead simple material test scene here. All we need to do to see some sort of atmospheric lighting, some volumetric lighting, is to add a light. And this applies to any kind of light. It could even be an HDRI, spotlight, point light. Then we just add a Redshift environment object. With those two things in place, we just add on the light, there's a volume tab. We bring the volume parameter, anything north of 0, and we have very cool, foggy kind of lights. I'm a big fan of this look. We can change the color of it, as you can see. Had to kind of exercise some self-restraint with this look in Otherside because I'm a big fan of volumetrics. Okay, so that's a little look at Redshift. Hopefully that might give you some interest into using Redshift if you enjoy messing around with the various render engines and what they have to offer. So next, let's switch gears and take a look at something else. We're going to take a look at cinematography inside a Cinema 4D. And by this, I mean a little bit of knowledge about how working in real-world film and TV production might inform how we go about working in a full CG film. So we can take a look at animating cameras. We've got, obviously, our big film and TV production camera, Red Epic in this case, with every accessory imaginable bolted onto it. And there we have our cute little, easy-to-manipulate virtual Cinema 4D camera, very easy to work with. The one on the left requires a big old crew, tons of people, tons of kit, thousands of dollars worth of equipment and people to do even the simplest of shots. We have much more flexibility, much more power with our virtual camera. And I guess what I'm saying is there is the temptation, because we can do anything with our virtual camera, we can make the camera do backflips and the rest of it dead easy, there is often the temptation to do it. And I refer to a famous late great uncle, as he said to his nephew, with great power comes great responsibility. Because we can do anything with our camera doesn't mean we should. And as Uncle Ben said that, he was kind of paraphrasing, as we all know. What he really meant was, just because you can do anything with a camera, it doesn't mean you have to. Point in case, here's something that was made. This is an old show reel that I made back in 2012. And at the time of it, I was probably dead proud, and I thought it was the best. Not so proud of it so much anymore. For me, this looks and feels a little bit dated. But regardless of whether you think it's good or not, this camera move is the kind of camera move that I guess is synonymous with CG. If we asked any good director of photography, even the best out there, we said we want to do this shot where we crash out from a billboard, hurtle down a motorway for a quarter of a mile, then ascend to the height of a helicopter, look down at these buildings, the DOP would be well within their right to laugh you out the room. So we can exercise some self-restraint. Please don't think I'm comparing my own work to this masterpiece, but this is an excerpt from a very well-known and very famous CG work called The Third and Seventh by a very enormously talented 3D artist called Alex Roman. It's surprisingly old. It's 8 years old now, which is surprising how well it holds up still, because it's incredibly beautiful. But this piece kind of did a lot to change the 3D visualization, in particular the architecture world, on its head, because it adhered to the restrictions and limitations of working with real-world cameras. It has a very mature, subtle, and understated and very beautiful understanding of cinematography. Point in case, this is an 8-year-old rendered piece we're looking at, and it still looks stunning. I'm still very much in admiration of it. So we can apply these kind of principles to how we think about camera moves. Here's a few different shots from Otherside, or from one of the spaces of Otherside. Just kind of, these are from me experimenting with cameras, but we can think about, if we were to make these shots, how we would make these shots, the kind of kit that they might be shot with, shot on. So we have simple tripod rotation, very kind of cheap camera move, but they can be very effective. Vertical moves, cranes, slider shots, of course, and dolly shots, a back and forth shot we also have. It's also worth considering the distance that a camera might move, as we would in a physical environment. So once again, there's the kind of temptation to go crazy with our camera moves inside of a virtual environment, just because we can. But a typical slider move might be 4 meters. 4 meters is quite a long slider move to do with a real camera. So if we're working in Cinema 4D and the camera move that we have is 8, 10, even more meters long, then we might think to ourselves, well, hey, this is moving really, really far, really, really fast. What's going on here? If we want a greater sense of motion, we can use parallax to our advantage. We can use layers of geometry and depth to have a greater sense of motion. Like we see here, this kind of folder in the back of that computer in the foreground. We can move the camera quite a short distance, but still have quite a dynamic shot through having detail in the the foreground, the midground, and the background. On the flip side, just for the sake of experimentation, this is maybe the kind of shot that the old me might have been compelled to put together. A very inorganic camera move. It's not to say it's completely not achievable with a director of photography. I'm sure there are cameramen that could do that. I just felt a little bit sick looking at that. It's all shaky. I'm all dizzy now. But either way, this is the kind of camera move that is somewhat synonymous with CG work. I haven't rendered this out as a full render, but I think if we were, even if I were to absolutely nail all my textures, all my lighting, everything about this scene, because of the camera move, I think we'd see this and register it as a CG work. So that's cameras. We can also consider aspect ratio when we're making a film. Obviously, this isn't something that we always have a call on. If our client says that they want a 16 by 9 piece, should probably deliver a 16 by 9 piece, but we can think about alternative aspect ratios, and most of our work will be on a digital platform, and therefore we're not constrained by any conventional aspect ratios like we would be in broadcast. Obviously 4:3, 16:9, and CinemaScope or ultra widescreen, in the case of this illustration, it's 21 by 9, but we have the power to choose what aspect ratio we like, and there's a feature film that came out within the last few months called The Ghost Story. Director took a very bold decision, but it's presented in 4:3. Quite a unique aesthetic to it. It evokes this kind of feeling of nostalgia of 16mm film. So we can consider aspect ratio. But if we had to think about CinemaScope and working in that ultra widescreen cinematic kind of look that I personally really like, we can also consider the type of lens that would be used for ultra widescreen, a CinemaScope presentation. So we have these two types of lenses. Now, most sort of 4:3 or 16 by 9 works would conventionally be shot on a conventional circular aperture lens, and on the right, anything that's super widescreen CinemaScope would be on an anamorphic lens. Note the difference in the shape of the aperture. Circular aperture on the left, and this is called an anamorphic lens where we have a stretched oval aperture. But this has knock-on effects on the aesthetic that we might consider between what kind of lens we're using. So lens flares, of course, lens flares have the potential to look incredibly cool. If we point our circular aperture lens to a bright light source, we'll get this pretty scattering of colored refractive elements like this. And if we use an anamorphic lens, then we have this nice, cool blue horizontal streak that is synonymous with cinematography, with cinema, with the movies. So obviously, point in case, I'm sure many of you have seen the first Star Trek film. It is chock-a-block full of lens flares. If you like lens flares, this for you is a treat. I'm sure we already know this. But I guess we can think about lens flares in post-production. I like to think I exercise some self-restraint with lens flares, but you can see from these kind of lamps, these light sources, it has that nice blue horizontal streak, as we would with anamorphic lens flares. Temptation is often to go really crazy with lens flares. So we can also think about depth of field. Now, depth of field, when I started working in 3D way back in my day, the idea of rendering with depth of field was crazy because it took so long. And so depth of field was something that was implemented purely in post-production, be it After Effects or otherwise, using plugins such as Frischlift Lens Care or Camera Lens Blur in After Effects. But we have so much more capacity to render Redshift in our renders, which has a greater sense of realism and looks much, much better. This is quite a subtle example, but you can see if you look in the background, at the lights in the background, at the lamps there, those highlights, The top one has this ever so slightly shallow depth of field. The lower one has a kind of an infinitely deep depth of field. And I think much like camera moves, like we're saying, sometimes, it can be less is more. The great power, great responsibility analogy, it can be very tempting just because we can now render very shallow depth of field with very little render overheads. We can go crazy with it. I guess it's worth looking at photography, looking at real film. How shallow a depth of field do they have? And we can kind of emulate this. Bouquet is the name of these kind of beautiful, pretty out-of-focus highlights that are an artifact from, if you point a camera at a bright light source in a dark environment and pull the focus ring out of focus, we have these nice, pretty, sparkly lights like this. Now, here's how they would look on our conventional circular lens, as you would have on your DSLR at home or even on your camera. With an anamorphic lens, they stretch as the aperture is an oval, a vertically stretched aperture. So you can see to the right of the frame of these two, this is a frame from The Dark Knight. Another example from Inception, these kind of slightly stretched oval bokehs. This is from Inception, as I say. So obviously Christopher Nolan, big fan of super widescreen anamorphic lenses. And so we can make bokeh and anamorphic bokeh in our renderer with tools like Redshift. Very easy to do. Here we've got a test scene, just a few little glowing lights. We can get our depth of field by turning on depth of field, which is called Bouquet in Redshift. Change the radius, which will determine how out of focus the out of focus areas are. And then we just have this aspect slider. So we can change that from 1, which will be a circle by default. And for anamorphic, we'd probably want something between 0.6 or 0.8 to get a kind of appropriate looking vertical stretch to our bokeh. And then we have other parameters that we can experiment with, like the aperture edge, if we want a finer rim to the aperture, and also the aperture blades. So by default, we'll just have a circular aperture, but we can add a kind of a hexagonal or pentagonal, or however many iris blades we want to have in our bokeh. So here's an example. It's same still from Otherside, but you can see at the top of the frame those vertically stretched bokehs. I guess I was kind of trying to be very authentic to this kind of anamorphic lens and widescreen look. Next up, we have focus pulls. Now, again, this is one where working in the real production world is infinitely more difficult than working in a virtual, a CG environment. We have a dedicated focus puller who's trained to just pull the focus ring of the lens with the appropriate equipment. Here's me in the park close to where I live, trying to do a focus pull just for demonstrative purposes. Does it look cinematic? Does it look great? I don't know, you tell me, but it's certainly not a perfectly smooth focus pull. You can see on the way into the foreground flower, it jerks a little bit. There's definitely some imperfections there. But we can do focus pulls in Cinema 4D in our render engine of choice. In this case, we're using Redshift. Once again, we turn on the bokeh parameter, have some depth of field there. And Redshift will adhere to the focal depth of that of our Cinema 4D camera. So I'm using the top view just to make things easy, pulling that camera distance back so the monitor in the background, that's in focus now. And to get a focus pull, we just plonk a keyframe on there, move the timeline, move the playhead a little distance down the timeline, bring our focal distance to the foreground monitor, and place another keyframe. Easy as that. And so if we look at our F-curve editor, that's what that's doing. We've got a nice, smooth focus pull. So if we render that out, here's how it looks. So this is that kind of perfect focus pull, and any focus puller DOP would hopefully give us a pat on the back if we showed them this. However, we can introduce some imperfections to our, oops, have I gone too far? What's happened here? I think I want to be here, and I think I want to play this. That's right. So we can introduce some imperfections to our focus pull by adding additional keyframes and having it, instead of being a straight from one object to another with our virtual focus pull, we can add a few keyframes so it's imperfect, as was my real-world case in the park, and have kind of a slight back and forth. It's almost like the kind of bouncing ball keyframe, and then we'll settle. So really easy, and we can kind of experiment with that, render it out. Is it right? Is it wrong? Is it a good amount of kind of an organic feel to it? But subtle difference. You can see what that's doing here. We go from the background monitor to the foreground one, and it does a little bit of wiggle before it settles on that. So we can think about kind of how perfect or imperfect we want our focus pulls to be, to bring a greater level of an organic feeling or a cinematic nature to our footage. Next, camera shake. So this is a shot from a promo that I made working with an awesome studio called Exponza based in Munich. Spikes dart out of the shoe, and the camera shakes out to give that all a whole load more impact. The camera shake can go a long way to giving us this feeling of action, this feeling of impact. Point and case, very simple test scene, few spheres blowing up without any camera shake. It looks like a whimper, it looks like there's no power there. However, we can apply some camera shake. So this is a case of camera shake being done in post. This is just being done in After Effects in this case, taking the frame, giving it a kind of a wiggle expression and shaking it about. It certainly does a lot to give us a greater sense of something is exploding to the point that the camera is being shook. However, my preferred way of doing camera shake always is to do it in 3D, is to do it in render where possible. As is the case here, I appreciate it's quite a subtle difference in this instance between this example and the one done in After Effects. But either way, I'd always opt to do it like this where I can. So it's very easy to set up. There are a few different ways of doing it. We could manually keyframe it. There's a tool called a motion camera in Cinema 4D. Me, the way I've kind of got used to doing it, and I'm a bit stuck in my ways in this respect, is using the vibrate tag, which is just randomizing the vibration of the camera. So we can simply keyframe the amplitude value of the rotation of that vibrate tag, add a few keyframes that are kind of in time with when these explosions happen. Through the F-curve editor, we can fine-tune the amount of shake that we have, and it can be as easy as that, setting up some camera shake. You can do it either way. You can do it with both, of course, with position or rotation. I guess it kind of depends on the look that you're going from. This example is just with rotation. I tend to find myself doing camera shake with just rotation, not position, but it depends. I guess, once again, we have to kind of think about a real-world context. If, for instance, we're emulating a camera move of someone walking down the street, documentary style, fly-on-the-wall cameraman, then it would likely have some position movement to it as well. You could be very much justified to do some position movement with an explosion. I guess one thing to bear in mind is that they don't kind of like trample over each other. I guess if you have a position rotation and a rotation vibration, you wouldn't want kind of one countering the other and having a kind of, they could like trample over each other potentially. So it's kind of open to interpretation. I do find myself using just rotation more than position also. But we don't have to use the vibrate tag or camera shake just for big Michael Bay style explosions. We can think about how our shot would be shot in a real world. I guess this would either be done with something like a camera zip line or even a helicopter, and that lends itself it's not a locked off tripod shot. By adding a subtle rotation, gives it some kind of further sense of an organic movement, some kind of floatiness that can look quite nice also. And I appreciate that this is a very subtle difference, but I do like using a subtle amount of vibration of camera rotation, randomness on slider tracks. But we can see this more clearly if we think about the top example and the bottom example. If we look at the negative space between the top of these tape drives and the top of the frame on our bottom one, it has a slight kind of float to it that might come from a slight bit of shake as our camera moves along a slider. Zooms are another thing we can consider. Now, zooms aren't particularly in vogue in cinematography, and they're not used quite so much in CG either. But I think they do have a place, and I think they can look quite cool. This is from a thing I made a few years back, a while ago, something I made in Octane. But as I was saying, kind of when we began talking about cinematography and its relationship to CG and Cinema 4D, I think because we can move the camera so close to our subject so easily, there's often the temptation, if we want to look at something closer, we move the camera closer to it. However, sometimes it can give ourselves a greater sense of realism by using a zoom. Very, very easy to do, and it has a very kind of organic, that kind of documentary or action type look, like our cameraman is reframing something. Very easy to do in Cinema 4D, of course. It's just a case of putting 2 keyframes down on the focal length parameter within our camera. Another thing we can consider is lens ghosting, which is a similar kind of artifact to lens flares, only deemed less pretty, less attractive. I'm told that this example of ghosting looks like Slimer from Ghostbusters. I enforce this is ghosting, not ghosts. But they are typically unwanted artifacts from pointing a camera, pointing a lens at a bright light source. So we can add ghosting in post-production. Again, it's a subtle difference here. The one at the top has no ghosting, this one does, but pay attention to these kind of green kind of haze, this kind of, it's a case of, in post-production, the way that I did this, I have these screens as a separate layer, simply upscale them, blur them a bit, give them the green tint, and that, to me, kind of seems to be quite authentic to the look of real camera ghosting, and it's something that I implemented a fair amount in Otherside, which is a perfect project to look into things like this, because we're looking at these screens, we're looking at these bright light sources in a high contrast environment, the kind of thing that would warrant ghosting in a real camera. So in summary, we can consider how fast or slow our camera moves are, our aspect ratio, our bokeh, is it anamorphic, is it circular, focus pulls, lens ghosting, zooms, camera shake are all things to consider. What if we were to go there and do all of them? Would it be good? Would it be bad? Well, it's probably not good, I'll tell you that much. I made this just for fun, something that threw everything at a single shot. So you've got everything that we've discussed here. I made this for fun, but the point I'm really trying to make here is less can be more. You don't have to do all of these things. They are merely things to consider. Who am I to say you have to have anamorphic bokeh if you're going to go widescreen? You have to have anamorphic flares if you're going to go ultra widescreen. Merely things to consider. I think you'll all agree that looks pretty wacky. And finally, lighting. I mentioned a specific lighting process that I used in Otherside, and I don't know about you guys, but I spent way too much of my youth staring at CRT screens. This is a macro shot from a CRT screen, and unlike modern LCD or OLED monitors, they have a very different pixel arrangement, with each pixel separated into this vertical red, green, and blue stripe. And I think it looks very, very cool. Now, with Otherside, here's the real star of the show. This is a CRT screen, and I went through this laborious process to get all the screen content into light textures inside of Cinema 4D. So what I do for any of the screen graphics, typically they were made in SD, nice and easy and fast and low res to work with. Then they'll get burnt to a DVD. Do you remember DVDs? They used to be a big thing, right? One of the good things about having a big PC is that you have a DVD drive. Modern computers, yeah, you see, who's laughing now, huh? But you can burn your graphics onto a DVD, and then it uses a DVD player, in this case an Xbox 360, into this knackered old CRT screen. And it produces this very beautiful look that I really like. Maybe it's nostalgia talking, maybe it's just something very unique. Oops, I've gone too far. This is what I mean to play. Where is my mouse? What's happening? Okay, good. So yes, this is some early R&D stuff from Otherside. This is just me having borrowed a macro lens, pointing it at this CRT screen, filming in 4K, and this isn't original content, this is just DVDs, but obviously you can't tell what it is because it's so macro, it's so close up. But it has this really cool look. I'm completely in love with it. And so what I did with all the screens, like I say, in Otherside, was film these shots in 4K, not always macro, very few in fact, but even if we kind of go wide and see the full standard definition resolution, we film it with a 4K camera, with a sharp macro lens or otherwise. These then got captured, brought into After Effects, treated a little bit, and then these became JPEG sequences that would be used as the textures for my lights in Redshift to be used in Otherside. So finally, I've just got a short reel of some of the graphics that I made, and as well as a friend and very talented motion graphics artist called Gordon Spurs. And here's just a little reel of some of the graphics that we made that were then captured on the CRT screen, as is the process that I just mentioned. Cool. So hopefully you can kind of see that that process gives the image a very weird, unique kind of buzzy edge quality. It's not high def anymore. It's not clean, flat, sharp line graphics. With that said, that brings us to a close. Thank you all so much for coming along. Thanks for anyone who's been watching on the live stream. I'm Thom Haig. If you want to check out more of my work and what I've been doing, that's my website. Follow me on Twitter, and I'll be around for a little while if you guys want to chat any more nerdy stuff, chat Cinema 4D, Redshift. Thanks so much for coming along. Cheers.